Welcome to the Friday Power Lunch, a weekly show amplifying the voices of the Virginia Grassroots. Each week, we provide engaging conversations about politics, culture, and women making change. Produced by the unstoppable women of Network Nova, our motto is, when we vote, we win. The Friday Power Lunch is recorded before a live Zoom audience. Follow us on social media. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and show us some love and become a sponsor through Patreon. The Friday Power Lunch. Badass women getting things done.
Woo, we went a little old school, 1983. Annie Lennox, I used to dance in the club to that song, love it. Feels a little dark, but it has a little interesting meaning. When that song was written, it was a very unhappy time in her life. And during the recording, when her partner made that great synthesizer sound, it just started to speak to her. She got up, she got into it, she got back into the music, and then they finished that great song so we can dance to it in the clubs. I love it. So I hope you're keeping your head up and you're keeping moving on. We have a great show for you today. Really a great guest to get to it. Hope you will. I see a lot of candidates coming in the room too. You know, we love this place to be a place where candidates can show up. And today I'm really excited because we're going to talk about, how we can add more civility and less negativity. And so we want to mitigate the forces of extremism in politics. And we do that for, trying to always look for that light when we can. Surround ourselves with people who provide that kind of good vibe and energy. Because I tell you what, when you look at the news every week, the extremism we see, like in voter suppression in Florida, we see these bad actors really using racism to try to silence voices. And we know this because we have studied history. So we will keep moving on. So we're so glad you're here today. Great to see everybody in the room. Let's get to it. Let's just get to the show. Welcome, everybody. It is February 17th. Welcome to the Friday Power Lunch. I'm Catherine White, your host, bringing you the guests, the issues, the action. We're going to fuel the grassroots community to get things done, because that's what we do. And we also like to make politics fun. And let's get perked up. I hope you have your coffee. I have mine right here. It's a dark roast. That's what we need. And this week, we're going to be talking about that theme, more civility and less negativity. And our fabulous guests on today's show, I love to bring them up. And I like to talk to each of the guests about really, how do you stay positive with so negative? So when we say hello, let's also just give me a quick answer to that. All right, first up, Narissa Rahaman, Executive Director of Equality Virginia. How are you doing today? Great to see you on this rainy day.
It's good to see you too, Catherine. I'm doing well. Yeah, it's a Friday, so I can't complain.
Can't complain, but boy, it's, we'll get to your segment later, but so much is going on when I talk about like negativity out there, especially against the LGBTQ, community and in general, just the attack is full on with our rights. And so how do you stay in the positive light?
I think one thing our staff recently and what we've been trying to do for the community too is really focusing on building out systems of care and self-care and community care. It's a tough legislative session for everyone this year, but in particular the LGBTQ community and our youth. And so we really wanted to focus on, giving folks an opportunity to step back when they needed to and take a break and take a rest and tapping in other folks. And I think that's what really got us through this session this year, is just prioritizing our self-care so that we can, keep this movement going for, just past February 25th.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. Totally agree. And we have talked about self-care on this program. And I just think that in all organizations like yourself, that is great leadership. So thank you so much, Narissa. Great to see you back in the room. So much to talk about. And all the way from Pennsylvania, we have Dr. Joe Romance. We promised that this would be a great segment on primaries and talk about You know, we always struggle with primaries and how to talk about it, but Dr. Joe Romance is a political science professor and author, and he's a co-author of the book Primary Elections and American Politics. Joe Romance, all the way from your car in Pennsylvania. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Yeah.
Good afternoon to everyone.
Yeah, we're so excited that we've been talking about primaries for a long time. That's always sometimes a point of contention, but today, the bigger lens you're going to talk about later, we're really excited about that. So in your work, in your day, in your life, what's your little tidbit of advice about staying positive?
Well, I've always believed that no matter what happens, you can always start your day over again. And
a redo.
And I really believe that, and everything's possible.
I like
and just if something's going wrong or you're upset about something, I don't mean to belittle people I'm not trying to demean people who have serious problems, right. But do the best you can to just start your day over again.
I love that, to give permission just to say, you know what, and sometimes we probably all have done that. You just need a nap. You take a nap just to start the day over again. Wake up and maybe it will be a better day. I love that. Thank you, Dr. Joe Romance. We promised a lot of interesting fun with you, so I can't wait to listen to Fennell Norton interview you today. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Next up, we always are talking about voting, all this ways, because voting is about how our voices are heard, So we have two great guests today to talk all about voting. Liz White, Jerome Legions, Liz White is here. So Liz White, Executive Director, Upvote Virginia, alongside Jerome Legions, Richmond Crusade for Voters. I'll start with you, Joe. Hello, how are you doing? And what's your little piece of advice for staying positive in such a sometimes negative world, it seems? Are you there, Joe? Maybe Joe, can you unmute? Yeah.
Are you talking to me?
No, what am I saying, Joe? Jerome. Sorry. Woo.
No problem.
Jerome Legions. Sorry, I just had that, the brain fart there first.
There you go. No problem whatsoever. Well, for me to stay positive, I stopped watching the news. I haven't watched the news in a year, and I'm so happy that I have stopped that, because it teaches me, it had taught me how to be fearful of the world, my neighbors for the most part. The nice thing about all of that is if people will tell you what's important and what's going on, but they're not going to dwell on as long as the news would do. Also, too, it gives me an opportunity to engage with my friends, communities across the board. And when we have those engagements, it's about their programs and projects, families and friends. So it's been a great process to just get rid of the news.
I love it. I hope that we can put these in bullet points. I think this is great. And Liz White, welcome. Good to see you. Upvote Virginia. How are you doing?
Doing all right. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you all so much for having me.
Yeah, awesome. So what did you have a little tidbit? What do you do to kind of push out that negativity?
Yeah. Nonpartisan democracy reform work isn't always glamorous, and you don't necessarily make a lot of friends all the time. But I think, honestly, communities like this and people who dedicate their time to unsexy grunt work, democracy reform, just making whatever piece of the process you've chosen to focus on, the idea that you would give your time and your passion and your energy and your resources to fixing that piece of the democratic process. I mean, that is so inspiring to me. And the fact that I get to do it as my job, I feel very, very privileged.
Well, we're excited. We've worked with you before, and you are definitely staying in the lane of fixing the whole process, from gerrymandering, redistricting to, really creating a healthy democracy through voting. So I thank you both for being here. We're going to get back to you. We'll unpack your part of the show in a little bit. So thank you for adding that stuff. And Jerome, I really like that idea. And it is so true. If you do block out the news and stop watching it, like everybody in this room knows, you go back 2 weeks later, really nothing has changed too much. You're like, you can definitely not get wrapped up because, as we said on the show before, they pull you in with all this clickbait, and all they do is get you enraged and just ruin your day sometimes. So thank you so much for that. Great guest we're going to have today. So just real quick for everybody in the room. First of all, great to see everybody. The rules of the road: use the chat. Hello, use the chat to introduce yourself, where you're from, and maybe you can share what you do to kind of stay in the positive lane. And if please just keep it civil in the chat. That's one way we try to make sure civility stays real. And also we have Michelle McKinney up there. Michelle, give a wave. She's our chat liaison. If you have any questions or issues, just reach out to Michelle McKinney up there and she will help you. So thank you so much. And stick around for the after chat, our favorite part after 1 o'clock, where we can unmute, let our hair down and talk all about what's going on and do our calls to action and just really build our community. And I want to say super, super duper thank you for supporting us as a Patreon. Some of you may know that we have a support button. We are on a subscription called Patreon, and that's just how these badass women here do the work. That little contribution every month when you become a patron really helps us keep the lights on. And last week, we got such an outpouring of love, and the positive vibe felt so good for that. I want to say thank you to the new patrons that signed up: Ben Litchfield, Dolly Langa, thank you, Dolly, Deanna Bear, Blythe Barrett, Alexandra Ritchie, Marianne Lako, Sue Nelson Sargent, and Shamali Hoff. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's so great to be supported. And next up, I want to make sure we bring up Fennell Norton for our power chat with my girlfriend, Fennell, and co-host. I love your shirt. What is this? What do you have on new on your shirt?
Isn't this wonderful?
Yeah, you threw me all off though. No, I can't see you. Yeah, right there. Good. I want one of those.
Isn't it fabulous?
Wait, Robin, what do you have? You have a shirt on too that's like that? So she's trying to tell us, but anyways, so I love it. And where did you get that shirt?
I got this from Gary Carter Green. He's a guest on our show from You Can't Beat Blue. So yeah, it's fabulous.
Okay, Gary, I want that shirt too. And I have to say that thank you to Mary Rarick. She sent me the loveliest little note of care. And I think that's another way I'll say of how we definitely insert more positive stuff is just, people reaching out to people is awesome. But today I wanted to talk something before I get to the rest of the show, our little power talk on really about the challenge that you've been making to this group during Black History Month. You've challenged us to do something, learn something new about something in history. And I wanted to say that I did my homework and I learned something new. And it's kind of just very simple, but I learned that Black History Month was started by a historian, Carter Woodson, in 1915. And I didn't know that it started as a week and went to a month, and then Congress passed a law and Reagan signed it. And we have now this wonderful month where we can really honor, recognize, and learn about African Americans' history. I just love that. So I want you, that challenges that intentional work.
Yes.
Yeah, and why that's so important is that we talked about that celebration of diversity and independent thought, right? That we see this attack on it. And during this month of Black history where there's this erasure that's trying to happen. So what are your thoughts on that, where we are today and what we could be doing more about making sure we push back and shine the light?
So I'm going to share what we're going to do this week, which is to read something. And I want to share 3 books that I think will be awesome if folks haven't had an opportunity to pick up something. Our whole notion about this has been to be intentional about Black History Month. I know we talk about it's only a month and it's the shortest month, but that's okay. We're going to be intentional this month. And then after the month is over, there's still opportunities to do so many other things. So here are the books that I'm going to share. The first one is Do the Work. And this book is by Camus Bell. It is awesome. When you guys get this book and open it up, it has all kinds of activities in it. It's just really simple activities of what to do, how to do it, what to say, awkward situation that you find yourself in. And it has really fun little things you peel off to sort of tell you how to do it. So it's a fantastic book. It's a workbook. So that's the first one. And then the second one is How We Win the Civil War. And we actually had Steve Phillips on this show, and he talked about this book. It is really an amazing book. It really goes through steps and plans, and he really connects this to the Civil War and how so many actions today are similar, but he gives a plan about how we go about ensuring that we move into a multiracial society. And then the last one is one of my favorites, Isabel Wilkerson, who is just a beautiful, calming soul. And this one is Caste. And I saw her recently on a TV show, and I was just taken by the way that she talks about how she talks about caste, but how things in this book really are some of the things we're seeing today. And one of the things that stuck with me was about the insurrection. And she said something. She said, Robert E. Lee himself wasn't able to go into the Capitol with the Confederate flag, and yet during the insurrection, that's what happened. So her book is really a lovely read in terms of opening our eyes to understanding why we're undergoing the things that we're doing and what we might be able to do to get past it. So that is the intentional something to do for Black History Month this week. Read something.
Oh my, yeah, those are great books. And I know when we talked the other day, getting ready for this segment, is that when I was sitting with my neighbor, she was telling me what she was doing intentional. And I was just so impressed that the church here has, in my neighborhood in Annandale, Virginia, it's the Little River United Church of Christ. And it is really cool because its history is that back in the 50s, when Virginia was segregated, it intentionally became integrated. And it's a wonderful church. And they're doing a little 9-week session called, it is called Confronting Whiteness. And as we talked about what she was learning, I really believe this is the answer, is education, is obviously everybody being intentional to inform yourself about the facts and history. Because this, we see this happening in Florida where they're saying, we don't want this taught. And there's a reason for that, right? There's a real intentional reason to say, we don't want this taught because we've seen this, because then you'll know that history is repeating itself again,
That is exactly right, Catherine. That is so true. And that is why it is so important that we push back as hard as we can on what's happening in Florida, what's happening in Virginia, what's happening all over the country in terms of us not understanding our history, all of our history. And if anybody has an opportunity to read other things or go online and YouTube, read how Isabel Wilkerson talks about understanding racism, about how to get beyond it. Because if we don't understand our history, and you know how the saying goes, we're bound to repeat it. So we must fight to make sure that history is taught everywhere.
Yeah, so true. I love it. So thank you for that intentional segment. I hope you all, I'm sure many of you read some of these books here. And please share in the chat any other books that you found really enlightening or classes you can suggest, because I do believe that is the way we really do, in a positive way, really move forward. Because once you can't unsee it. You can't unlearn it. And you also have to do your own homework and go looking for the history, because sometimes you have to unearth it. All right. So I want to say that we are always about action in this room, and so much has been going on in the General Assembly. And I want to welcome LUISA Boyarski, our fearless leader of the Grassroots Coalition. Hello, LUISA.
See you, Catherine. Happy to have you back. We haven't overlapped on a program in a while, so it's good to see you. I'm going to cover a couple of different things, right? The legislative session is wrapping up. I will say, as we unfortunately expected, many of our bills had a very, very tough time in the House. But what this does is it gives us the opportunity to message when we get to the elections this year about who voted for what and who was in support of what issues, right? So we are going to be working on that from the coalition's perspective, but I do have one good piece of news that our bill on teacher compensation passed both the Senate and the House unanimously. So teachers will be getting more funding, which is so critically important, as we know, in our public school system. And I do have one last call to action to share with you, and it is for a bill that would provide better mental health resources to schools. This one is still in the House Appropriations Committee and really could use your support. So as you are hearing our presentation on the power lunch, please take action on that call to action. There are also a couple of other environmental bills that we are tracking, but we are trying to determine the best way to get involved. So please make sure that you are signed up for STARE's emails and my emails. Those may be things where we're going to need you to take action during the conference where the bills are going to be reconciled between the two houses, or it might be other action that needs to be taken more at the executive level. So we are tracking that and we'll let you know as soon as we have the clear strategy going forward. I do want to transition because, as we know, this is a big election year in Virginia, and we have a big election coming up on Tuesday, February 21st. I want to encourage everyone, if you have not already, to find a way to support Jennifer McClellan's race. I'm putting in the chat opportunities for text banking, phone banking, canvassing for McClellan. It's really important that we are keeping up the momentum through these special elections in Virginia to keep people and voters engaged, because we have a ton of primaries coming up and we want to make sure that they are listening. They know that their voice is really, really important this year. There's also, and I think someone already put it in the chat, the special election in Wisconsin, or maybe it's just a election in general for the Supreme Court. It's a primary, and we're trying to also in Wisconsin with other groups across the country just get out the vote there. Isn't necessarily a weigh in on who you should vote for, but just to know that the election does exist. And so the last thing I want to remind people is we do have elections coming up for the whole state, House and Senate, which I'm sure you've heard multiple times for this year. But it does mean that even prior to the general election, we have a lot of Democrats running against other Democrats in primaries. And the one thing that I've been doing when I get approached by candidates who are running in a contested primary, I ask a couple questions. The first is, what are you trying to accomplish through this race, even if you're not going to be able to win the primary? So why are you in this race to start with? Because the one thing I'm trying to gauge is, are you just out there to tear someone else down, or do you really have something that you're adding? Are you adding the ability to reach new voters? Are you adding a new perspective on, how you would approach legislative strategy? Are you adding the fact that you have a particular lived experience that you feel is missing and needs to be, needs representation? So they need to be able to articulate that. Secondly, I always ask, if you don't win the primary, will you be all in for whoever does? And I want to hear that specifically, because the fact is, it doesn't help us if we put a lot of energy into a primary race and then you as a candidate who didn't win step back and don't want to get involved in the general election. Our overall goal, as we all know, is to be flipping seats and to be flipping our House blue and increasing our lead in the state Senate. And if you are not all in on those general elections, that doesn't serve our, the overall party's goals. So I think those are some of the things I'm looking at. If you have the opportunity to talk to some candidates, think about what are your talking points and where do you want to push them to think about how are they using their primary race in a way that is going to best serve the party as a whole going forward.
You're making me think, Louisa, that we've talked about primaries and challenges, and there's a lot of opportunities in that, like you said. It makes me feel like we need a whole class on this, not a class, but something we should really, before we even get into primaries, I think we've talked a lot about it, and there's so much to unpack here. And that's why we had Dr. Jerome on, because we realized no one wanted to come on and talk about it, number one. So we're taking this 30,000 foot view so we can talk about overall the role of primaries, some of the history around it, but because it's sort of, tough when we're trying to do our work and there is primaries, where to put your energy, correct?
Absolutely. And I think, again, that's why I'm, challenging everyone to think through, what role do you want to play, right? It could be that you want to work on particular campaigns. It could be that you want to be working on getting out the vote, which is really, not necessarily choosing one side or another, but saying we just need more people to be weighing in on these primary elections. As we know, not many people come out and vote in primaries. And what happens is it's usually people who have more extreme views on both sides of the aisle who tend to come out for primary elections. We would be better served if we had more people who have, views across the spectrum voting in our primaries. And so lots of different ways to get involved.
I think so. And I just think in general, because we're talking about voting today and all the things about Jared, what you're saying is how voters are even heard in their district, how you're even districted in that, right? And how civically engaged you are. But I do think this year is a little bit more complex because we have redistricting. So none of these districts, they're new districts. So everybody has a chance to get into a race. There's new voters in that. So it really kind of does lend itself to be an opportunity here. And it's also a confusing opportunity, I'll say that. So, we'll see who's running, who's not running, who's jumping, who's moving to Senate. But because of the redistricting, it adds a whole different view of what even a primary is, because there's no incumbent really, but there is, right? Like that's the confusing part.
It's definitely messier, and that is for sure. But what it does say is all of these seats, you have to run for your seat. And it's going to remind those legislators who have been in those seats for a long time, you're not safe anymore because it's been changed, right? Your districting lines are different. People who are voting for you are different. And you need to come back out and convince voters why you should be the one who continues to represent them. And I think that that's really, it's a good thing, right? We need to be, I don't want to call it cleaning house, but it really is reminding people that they are representing specific individuals and they need to continue making sure that they are talking to those individuals, hearing what their concerns are, and figuring out the best way to represent them in Richmond.
No, I agree. And so I think that's good. And I want to say that one thing that everybody in this room has been watching, maybe the Governor Youngkin, some of the disappointing decisions he's made, especially around the economy, when he decided not to do anything, pretty much let the legalization of the pot retail industry die, which is really hard for people doing business. You need a surety when you're in this kind of business. So I think that is a really big hurt for the Virginia economy, as I love Delegate Don Scott on the floor talking about, that really just loss of 2,500 jobs that are now in Michigan. Thank you for that. And no, thank you. But really keeping people aware of what's going on is our job. And lastly, and I want to bring up the next guest, Narissa Rahaman of Equality Virginia. We are really concerned about what we've been seeing, these direct legislative attacks on the LGBT community. They're just so harmful and hurtful. Narissa, I would like to start our segment out with Danica Rome, if we want to bring that up. Danica, this went viral, so emotional, and it just really got
dealing with forcibly outing trans kids, and you didn't even talk to the one person in this body who actually knows what it's like to be scared to death as a 13 and 14-year-old kid of anyone finding out that you're actually trans. You have no idea what you're doing. You have no idea the harm you're causing. These kids are watching this right now all across the Commonwealth. Do better for them. Of having to hear kids being used as political props and thrown to the wolves. There is nothing in this bill that actually says, well, maybe we're going to take discretion. Maybe in this, we're going to say that in one kid's case, it could be unsafe. Maybe in one kid's case, it could get them hurt. Maybe in one kid's case, it's going to create an environment that's not going to be welcoming for them. And that leads to suicide. That leads to homicide. That leads to beatings. That leads to homelessness. 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ, and that the number one reason for that is family rejection. And when the delegate presented this in committee and made the entire case about human trafficking, what happens to homeless youth? Homeless youth are exponentially more likely to be victims of human trafficking, to be prostituted. We are dealing with dire consequences on a bill as reckless as this. Forcibly outing kids, regardless of the safety of their home, regardless of what's going to happen to them when they get home.
I mean, that is hard to watch. I mean, it just still stings in my heart. I mean, it's just emotional hearing that directly from her. And that's why we really have been wanting to bring you on for a while to talk about this. We've been watching and tracking these bills. So let's talk a little bit real quickly, your reaction to that. And then please let the people know what you do. And then let's talk about some of the bills on the floor. So how are you feeling when you see this going on down at the General Assembly?
Yeah, I think it's not a question of how I'm feeling. I'm a cisgender woman, and so anti-trans bills don't personally impact me. What I'm concerned about is when these bills are introduced and we have trans youth all across Virginia that are watching their dignity and their humanity and their right to safety debated by lawmakers around not just here in Virginia, but around the country. There's a recent survey that was done that 86% of trans youth are watching what is happening around state houses around the country. And it is, immediately impacting their mental health, their ability to live authentically or show up to school and feel safe. And so, I'm personally impacted because I care about trans youth. I have trans people in my lives. I have friends who are trans, and, even the, adults I know are impacted by this. And again, it's not just when bills are introduced and, if they're signed into law in other states, it's really this mere introduction, the existence of legislation like we saw in Virginia this session, 12 bills directly impacting trans people, mostly trans youth. Right. It begins to have a harmful, chilling effect on them. As these bills were introduced, we had conversations with youth and parents, is it safe for my kid to go to school? Is it safe for us to go to the doctor? And these bills have real life consequences on folks.
Well, what you brought up is very important to the national, like you said, cumulatively across the country, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of bills, and then hundreds and hundreds of conversations that, that you see this daily of the dishing out of just really negative, really negative attacks on people and lifestyles and so forth. And it's just really, it's really cruel. And one thing I thought about when I saw Delegate Rome stand up on the floor is I thought how important it is to have representation, how important it is that she's there and that she always has been a great person to represent her district. But being transgender herself, it's just so important that she's there to be able to be the voice and to really call attention to this in a way I don't think other people may be able to do like she did. And she really called it out that no one had talked to her. No one really wants the information. So I thought it was really, really important to watch her words, because it was just, I think then the whole state of Virginia and the world was watching her. And I think it's important. So in that, let's talk about what's happening on the floor and what's Equality Virginia in your mission is doing now. And some maybe the bills that you're sort of watching or that are no longer maybe even in play, but give us an idea of what's going on.
Yeah, and just to jump in about Danica's floor speech, is very passionate, is very emotional. She speaks from personal experience. But at the end of the day, what we need is non-impacted folks speaking up for trans people. We need cisgender women who play sports to speak up and share more about, that they welcome having trans women play on their sports team. And I think, we wish that Danica did not have to do that. Just telling our stories requires us to relive a certain amount of trauma, where, we shouldn't have to share our personal stories to get people to see us as people. And so
I mean,
I wish she didn't have to stand up and say those things. We're glad she did, but you know, at the same time, it would have been monumental to see, you know, cisgender colleagues stand up for their colleagues in the House. So
I'm sure we just know what that went viral. Let's just say that she is a powerhouse and she's an amazing advocate for just her community and for Virginia. So there's no doubt about it. And so yeah, tell us, so we'll just wrap up. Tell us what is going on. Is there any other bills right now you're tracking, and what would you like for the people in this room to do?
Well, all bills Equality Virginia we're tracking or took a stance on this session. Most of them have died. That is, and that goes for the good bills and the bad bills. So as of yesterday, all 12 anti-trans bills that were introduced are officially dead. We had 2 that did cross over from the House, and those were killed in Senate committee yesterday. You know, this year was really a stark year for Virginia, of really just sort of hitting rock bottom in terms of legislation. You know, lawmakers, anti-equality lawmakers were doing, introducing, you know, like I said, we had 12 anti-trans bills introduced. 3 of those bills would ban access to gender affirming, age appropriate, life-saving medical care for trans youth and in some cases, some adults. We had 4 forced outing bills, bills that would in some way have required students to be outed to their parents, whether they're supportive or not. And that's for situations where students might want to update their name on any school record, not just like their official roster, but it could be a library card, it could be anything. We also had, you know, so there were 4 bills sort of relating to forced outing, and then we saw 5 bills that would have banned participation on sports teams for trans kids. And so 2 bills, like I said, did crossover out of the House, a forced outing bill and an athlete ban, and those were killed yesterday. We additionally had some, you know, great bills that were introduced this year. And again, Senator Eben and Delegate Sickles introduced their bills to repeal the, you know, now defunct, but still discriminatory ban on same-sex marriage in our Constitution. You know, Delegate Sickles and Senator Eben went the straight repeal route this session because they had heard from their Republican colleagues that, you know, we could get behind supporting a straight repeal instead of previous sessions where they repealed the language, but then also added in affirming language. Delegate Sickles' bills that he introduced were never even scheduled for a hearing in the House. And then just this morning, a House Rules Subcommittee, you know, without debate or any comments, killed Senator Eben's marriage amendment. And so that's really disappointing to see, you know, here in 2023 that some Virginia lawmakers believe that marriage equality is still up for debate when it is, it's not. So it was sort of for our session this year, you know, not a lot of progress, but we made progress in terms of just defending the progress we have won and really just defending trans equality this year.
We appreciate what you all do. And if you want to put any calls to action or how people can get involved with Equality Virginia, we'd appreciate that. That is so important, especially with coming up in this election, what we know what's going to happen with these conversations in this election. We want to be prepared to be supportive, like you said. So we appreciate you bringing that positive vibe into the room and making sure we're doing the right thing. Thank you so much, Narissa.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn it over to the next part, talking about, you know, Fennell, hello. Let's bring up Dr. Joe Romance and get right to the romance.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Kathleen. For those of you just joining, I'm with Dr. Jerome. He's the co-author of the new book, Primary Elections and American Politics. And so let's talk a little bit about these primaries. You've already heard some of the discussion. So how did this system get started in the first place?
Well, it started a long time ago, over 100 years ago. And the idea was to make the parties more accessible and democratic. The way candidates were selected in the 19th century was that local party committees would decide who would be the nominee. And this lent itself to a lot of corruption. And even if it wasn't corrupt, it definitely lent itself to being exclusionary. Okay? And so the progressive movement really pushed for more openness. All the problems of democracy are cured by more democracy was the kind of idea.
Mm-hmm.
So in the early part of the 20th century, some states, Robert La Follette led it in Wisconsin, began to push for primaries. Let the voters of the party decide who the candidate is. At first, this was adopted almost at all levels, okay, even at the presidential level. But it dropped out at the presidential level after an initial flurry of use in 1912.
Mm-hmm.
But it stayed on at the state and local level. So for choosing your congressman, your senator, your House representatives, state delegates, governors, all that was still chosen by primaries. And primaries became entrenched at that level, although not at the presidential level.
All right, then, so once we've done that, we sort of moved out. Now we have these primary races. You've heard us talk about some of them. But what happens? Is it really the more the merrier?
Well, the thing is, that what we find out is that primaries don't normally attract a huge number of voters. So it's kind of, so the idea was more democracy will get people talking about democracy, will get people talking about politics. But the thing is, many people didn't. Okay, many people didn't show up. So primaries tended to be, still tend to have very low turnout. And who does show up for primaries? It does tend to be ideologically more extreme people. Not always, but that's a tendency. And people who are a little less compromising, a little more ideologically driven. And I was noticing one of your earlier guests talked about asking candidates whether, in primaries, whether they would still support the nominee if they lost the primary.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That becomes a problem. Primaries, in effect, see, back in the old days when the exclusionary local county and state committees chose candidates, they wanted to win above all else. They were less ideologically driven. And so, and any kind of fighting that went on was tended to be all behind closed doors. There was no airing of dirty party secrets in public. Primaries sort of brought that all out into the public. And so there does become intense primaries that could become very nasty. I'm not saying all, I'm just saying it became more possible. And there's some really horrible stories about that that I could tell if you wanted. But then, there's that also amusing that occurred.
So here's my question. So now we have this primary process, and you really, the goal is to get the best candidate that you can get. And I think in one of your books, you talk about excellence and what that really means. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how do we really get the candidates who are going to be best qualified, and to your point, excellent?
And I'm sorry, what's the last word?
Excellent. You're excellent.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Yeah. Well, it is a real challenge. By the way, primaries can produce great candidates. They do all the time, right? It's just that they open up the possibility of less stellar candidates. And with that low turnout, you can get someone who just sort of sneaks through, like George Santos.
Yeah.
All right. And that can kind of shock the system, and now we have another story about a Republican congressman from Kentucky who seems to have a whole made up life. And you would think maybe if it was public, we wouldn't have these problems, right? Because the press would cover them or whatever, but this doesn't get exposed all the time. And then in the old days, again, to go back to the conventions and the old ways of selecting candidates, the party leaders did know everything about their candidates usually. So they made sure it didn't happen. Now, how do we get excellence then? Well, the only way we're going to get consistent excellence, all right, is if people pay attention to primaries and we boost turnout. And turnout will lead to more coverage, more debate, more discussion. But that's the tricky part. How do we boost turnout? People say they want more democracy, but do they really want more democracy? And I'm not a pessimist here, by the way, but we need to get more people, less ideologically driven people. We don't want to, by the way, I'm not against ideologically driven people being there. I just want less ideological people being there, part of that process too. You know, we want in our book, we would suggest we want more people participating in meaningful ways.
So how do you really get there? Are there any kind of structural things that you can talk about that would help us get there in a more meaningful way? Because we do have these primaries, and I don't know, sometimes candidates like George Santos and others have emerged and folks were thinking, well, geez, it would have been really better if we had had a much better candidate. Is there some way that we can do that?
Well, one way possibly, I'll answer that question two ways. One suggestion, of course, is always new parties. We want a multi-party system, but that really doesn't seem likely. For better or worse, our system structurally is geared toward creating a two-party system. So the best solution is to try to reform the parties internally. And one of the ways that we suggest in our book is ranked choice voting. If you have more opportunity, you know, people don't necessarily like the final choice, right? But if you give them opportunity to rank choice voting, they might be more interested in voting. It might draw more people in because, you know, they have a more opportunity to register their opinion about all the candidates. And that might lead to possibly different candidates winning, less ideologically extreme candidates winning in some cases.
Huh. That's interesting. We're going to talk about ranked choice voting in one of the next sections, and I think that'll be pretty interesting. But I guess my other question is, in terms of the structural way that we go about this process, how do we get a greater debate happening about our primaries and the candidates in it? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, one of the problems, of course, is something that this podcast is trying to, I assume, alleviate, which is that we've had the kind of collapse of local media. You know,
Mm-hmm.
everything's become nationalized. You know, and I think one of the problems is we need more avenues for attention on local issues. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, back when the mass media was more decentralized, you had local reporters who would cover these things, you know? I mean, go back. I know we're talking about you guys are interested in Virginia, but let me just come back to Santos again.
Yeah.
There was a local Long Island paper that completely exposed him. A wonderful example of what local media can do, except to say that it wasn't good enough. You know, I mean, people didn't register. That story didn't get enough traction. You know, and of course the large mass media, cable news, you know, is always interested in national issues. And of course, you know, national issues are important, and you know, the rights of LGBT community are national issues as also state issues. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yes, they're both. What I'm trying to say is, though, that there's no attention paid to these local races. We need to reform the media. Now that I don't know how to do. We need to see more podcasts with more people listening. We need to see something to replace the old local newspapers who covered these things.
Yeah.
So we could see that. So they could expose, if not necessarily elevate the good candidate, let's at least expose the frauds, right? And get them out. You know. By the way, I happen to believe that just average people can be political. Average people can even be candidates. It's fine for the state legislature or Congress to have just average, typical people in it. Why not? But I don't want frauds and worse than average. I don't want less intelligent. I don't want less honest and forthright people, right? So that's something to think about.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm just going to go back and underscore the piece on George Santos, because I remember reading that as well, that there was a local paper, to your point, that completely outed him, and not a single other paper, national news media picked it up. And so we do have challenges with local newspapers and media, but we do have some avenues here that we're trying to work on. Is there any final thoughts that you have? Because I love what you've said about regular people being part of this process, making sure that candidates are out there, local news, getting out there in front of folks, which is really how you bring these local candidates to light. So I love that. What else would you like to send us away with in terms of thinking about these primaries?
Well, primaries are here to stay. I don't think anything's going to change them, and they probably shouldn't be. I mean, they're part of the democratic process. I think they may have been a mistake, but they're here now, and they can be made to work. It can be made to work. And it takes, it takes people wanting to be engaged in the process. All right. And I think that it's really up to us to say that to each other, to talk about politics with our neighbor, maybe not necessarily shove it down their throats if they're not particularly political, but, these things are important, and they're part of something that you do as a citizen. The ancient idea of citizenship was actually, by the way, an office. It was actually considered an office. And one of the things that democracy does is say that we all are office holders. We are the office of citizen. And that's important. And you are not being a good citizen if you don't vote. Because why? Because you hold this office of citizen. Now, we grant it to everyone. Well, there's issues with immigration, of course. But we grant it to everyone. So in a sense, you're doing your duty, all right? Because you are being political, at least a little bit. And politics, we should never be afraid to talk about politics, because it concerns us all, the common good.
I think that's a really wonderful point in terms of the two things you don't discuss, religion and politics. And I think that's probably why we're where we are today, because we have to discuss them more. Dr. Jerome, thank you so much. Catherine, is there anything you wanted to offer before I slip away?
Thank you.
No, I love that, the last just really sets up the next segment, Dr. Romance, is that the idea of this being the citizen and being a citizen and making sure that you vote. So I think why we're getting a big discussion around voting is that when you suppress that, when people figure out how can I suppress people and their voices. And so I think this next segment will be really interesting, because we know that communities of color, you look at Florida, how they use redistricting to shut out Black communities, and that would just happen recently. So as much as you want to go vote, and if you do vote, people are making sure your vote doesn't matter. And I think that's why this next segment is really important. So thank you. Yeah,
Can
go
I
ahead.
say one little thing?
Yeah, please, you can say it.
That's something structural we could do. The Supreme Court refuses to do it, but we should move toward believing that redistricting is not about creating partisan advantage, that we need to effectively say gerrymandering is wrong. And actually, some political scientists have worked on ways to show that, but the Supreme Court is not really to accept their arguments about how you redistrict fairly to create competitive districts, not districts that are safe for the party.
Yep. And we saw that in that decision, right? They just said, okay, South Carolina, you can gerrymander away. It's not our job. Thank you, Dr. Romance. We have a lot of work to do. I appreciate that. And I want to thank you, Fennell Norton. I'm expecting that shirt in the mail. I'm just teasing, but I just love it. All right, let's talk about democracy. And are this ranked choice voting a remedy? And I'm here to talk with Jerome. And I won't call you Joe, I promise. I'll call you Jerome Legion. And I want to start, and then Liz White from Upvote Virginia, and then also you're president of Richmond Crusade for Voters, Jerome. I want to start with you to talk about, since we just really ended up with ranked choice voting and communities of color, your thesis is really, it really helps communities of color when you get into ranked choice voting. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, first off. Well, when you look at organizations such as the Richmond Crusade for Voters, and we started in 2 years after the decision to overturn separate but equal. So we kept staying in line with what we've been doing, which is increasing the African-American vote for the most part, get more people educated as far as voting is concerned, as well as things such as study the records of the candidates that's running for office. We wanted to make sure that as we studied the records for the candidates that's running for office, that they were also in tune with what the African-American community was asking for, which is a fair opportunity to live a better life, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so we wanted to make sure that our candidates were actually spreading that kind of election or bills across the board, and not just to favor the few. And so with all that being said, we recognize as far as the Richmond Crusade for Voters that we're still in that process. We're still going through the process. We have to educate the people that's inside of the Richmond Crusade for Voters in order to make sure that we get the message out so that there's fairness and equity, all right, amongst all of the folks that's the elected official choose to represent. And so with that being said, we moved towards ranked choice voting, and that was not an easy process for the Richmond Crusade for Voters. And the reason why is because we understood the process. You listen to the candidates, you choose, and you go vote. Well, now we're saying, let's try something a little different. And it wasn't easy at first, but we had a president at the time that stood steadfast and said, let's get in front of this. If we get in front of this, we can actually start educating not only ourselves, but the public as well. We can educate folks to show that we are not losing any type of strength as far as the African-American community or any other community for that matter. But because now with ranked choice voting, we're not going along for the sake of. We get an opportunity to actually do things such as review all of the candidates and say, I want this one, but I can live with this one, and I will be satisfied with this one. And so that means that what we have now is that we have a process of educating ourselves about the differences between the candidates and how much are they in line with my beliefs, if you will, as to how we would like to see our communities engaged, how we would like to see our communities flourish for the most part. And so that's what ranked choice voting has done for us. But here's the interesting thing about it is the fact that we were sitting down, and when I say it was a process, it was not an easy process. The way we got it through to folks to see how ranked choice voting could work was the fact that we just walked in the door with a box of candy and said, what are your favorites, and ballots, and people voted for their favorite candies. And when they realized that that candy was not winning, they were still satisfied because they still had a choice in which M&M won out.
Oh, sorry, there's some feedback coming through.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't know where it's coming through. Hold on 1 second. Okay.
It was pretty simplistic, but when that happened, you could see the light bulbs go off in the room.
I love it. So, you are getting a good quality out of that. Up here in Virginia, we did ranked choice voting when we had in the primary election in 21, and Jennifer McClellan, I'm pretty sure, won that ranked choice voting, and that was really interesting. And I think that there's a lot of people in this room advocating for the ranked choice. Some people think it could be the overall solution, and that's why I want to bring up Liz White, which from Upvote Virginia. And then just want to say that if for people in the room, the Crusade for Voters have been around 67 years. We love organizations that stay in the game. So I want to celebrate that for you, Jerome. Now I want to bring up Liz White and talk to you both. First, talk about Upvote Virginia, and you cover redistricting and all kind of different situations around voting. It's, rank vote. Tell us a little bit about the organization and what you're doing.
Sure. So we grew out of One Virginia 2021, who worked on redistricting reform last year. Once the redistricting process was over, we kind of took a look at, we reshuffled a lot of things, and we took a look at this statewide movement that had been built and everything we've learned. And we said, rather than pack up and go home, let's expand the democracy reform mission and let's continue to move forward and figure out how to work for Virginia's voters. And we chose ranked choice voting as our first focus.
No, sorry. My computer just went out for a second. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, it's funny you bring that up because it is. We went through this redistricting. We were all excited. We thought, if we can have a new way to draw the lines where it's nonpartisan, put it on the ballot, and then to watch that process go forth was really excruciating because we realized that it wasn't perfect because the way that it was decided, the political people couldn't help but put themselves on the committee, right? We know that wasn't your goal at One Virginia to have these political folks on it, but they couldn't help themselves. They were on it. And we saw it then go flip over to the Supreme Court. And then here we are with some of this we're trying to deal with now with these new lines and so forth. But, it is what it is. So now with this, tell us then where you're at now, trying to educate voters around this. You're trying to get Virginia to accept this, or is it just in certain locations, all locations? Tell us a little bit about ranked choice voting in your perspective.
Sure. So the only law currently on the Virginia books is from 2020. It was a bill from Delegate Sally Hudson and co-patroned by Delegate Patrick Hope and several others. And it gives the option for any locality to adopt ranked choice voting for their local governing body. So city councils, board of supervisors. Towns are not currently included in that just because of the way it's worded. So it's a very narrow pilot program. It sunsets in 2031, but it is meant to kind of be to lay the groundwork and let each locality decide for themselves if RCV is something that works for them. And something that's nice about RCV, as opposed to some other democracy reforms, is it really isn't one size fits all. Arlington County has adopted ranked choice voting. They're the first, yay. And they are going to use it for their Democratic primaries. And they're electing 2 candidates this year. So it's a multi-winner election. I learned at the event we just had on Monday that they are the first multi-winner primary to use RCV in the country. So firsts on firsts. But so we are helping educate voters, talk to communities, and help elected officials and voters work together to determine if ranked choice voting is something that will serve their community.
Right. Over to you, Jerome. I'm curious in your mind, if you can enlighten the audience, where are some of these races that maybe recently that where ranked choice voting was used and that it's worth really looking at? What comes to mind is the race in Alaska, right? So in your mind, could you tell the audience there's some that some current races where it was used and it came out, you thought, pretty successful?
Well, the one in Alaska I thought was pretty successful for the most part. We talked to Arlington last night, and so we're really paying attention to how it's going to happen in Arlington. And so we're thinking that it's going to work out well in Arlington and start using those as examples to say, see, ranked choice voting does work. Actually, the Republicans used it in their primary a couple of years ago? And it did well for them. So with that being said, we're saying that it is working. It's a slow burn, right? But we know that I strongly feel that it's going to take off because it's going to give masses people an opportunity to vote their heart instead of along the idea that we need a win, if that makes any sense at all.
It's sort of really a lot of the focus on educating yourself about the voters, not so much the party. And Liz,
exactly.
Yeah, when you're thinking about this in nonpartisan terms, and when we try to present ranked choice voting as a way to curb extremism and a great tool for it, why do you think, and both of you can answer, why don't you think it's used more broadly in your mind? I'll start with Liz and then Jerome.
Sure. I think that one of the broad benefits of ranked choice voting is that it really does not allow an extreme divisive candidate to win. Someone who has a really strong following, but that's only, let's say, 35% of the electorate,
Right.
They also need broad support to win an election. So if they don't also have a whole bunch of people willing to rank them second or maybe third, if they only have that narrow appeal, they cannot win that election, which is, there's some stuff in the chat. I mean, it's a pretty, I think, ill-kept secret that that's part of why the Republicans used ranked choice voting in their 2021 gubernatorial primary, because they wanted to make sure that a hypothetical individual who might have a loud, narrow base did not win that crowded primary, which she could have done with 35% of the vote in a, whatever, 6-7 candidate race. They wanted to set themselves up for someone who could win in the general, and they knew that an extreme candidate wouldn't do that. So they looked specifically for a method that would elect a candidate who has the majority, has some support from the majority of candidates. Right. And that really is the biggest thing about ranked choice voting.
So it's a tool that could be used in that case. It seems like when you want to, and then like Jerome, what are your kind of input on that? So it's good in this case, but then why isn't it used more broadly, do you think, across the country? Because maybe it's not a cure-all, but why do you think it's not being adopted? Is it because still people want to control the outcome to some degree?
Exactly. People want to control the outcome to some degree. Some folks are fearful for their positions, and so they're thinking ranked choice voting might get rid of me, okay, for the most part. But then when we talk about the African-American community, and then let me just speak on that, I think with that being said, when you have organizations such as old as the Richmond Crusade for Voters, the African-American churches for the most part, it felt as though voting was always a do or die situation, a struggle. And so whatever gains that were made through the process that has been used, it's like, why give up a good thing that is already working? And so the education process is that it is working, but then here's something that you may want to consider that may work better. And so that's where we are with ranked choice voting, is that we're going through this process to say, how well is that one choice vote, that one choice vote has been working for you, considering the outcomes that you're still complaining about, like poor education, poor economic opportunities for the most part. And so now you get to talk to several people, if you will, and say, this is truly what I want. Also, too, it may be a thing is whereas you have folks that are saying, well, elected officials, I said I'm gonna stop calling them politicians and call them elected officials to remind them that we put you in office. But to remind our elected officials to say, don't just play in this area, come over here and talk to the folks elsewhere, because you're going to need their vote also. And so when we start understanding that as part of the voting process, we will more so start to adopt ranked choice voting on a greater scale, to realize that we can't say so-and-so is not knocking on my door. Well, they're going to knock on your door. They're going to be your best friend on social media and all this other kind of wonderful stuff, because they need your vote now, instead of saying, this is the voting population over here, and we know that you're not going to vote over there.
Yeah, I mean, we know that it's not like a one thing that's going to cure everything, because as you know, white, and we dealt with Liz with and really understanding gerrymandering. I remember when I came into this so many years ago, everybody was talking about gerrymandering. You look at the state of Ohio, and it is so terrible with its gerrymandering that it's really hard for any voices to be heard. The most extreme people get elected. So it's almost like you have a couple things we need to do to kind of like retune the system. But Liz, one question, then I know we got to wrap up because we're a little bit over time. In Virginia, and is it our constitution that will have to change? It have to be voted in the legislature? What's the big, if we wanted to go for the statewide and really, I'm assuming it would have to come from the Congress, from the General Assembly. Is that true?
Gloriously, the answer is no, it doesn't need to be a constitutional amendment. After last decade, it's nice that this doesn't require one. No, this is just a general, at this point, the localities, it's literally just a majority vote from your Board of Supervisors or your City Council. So, 5 to 11-ish people get to make that decision. To expand it to other
or senator,
not because of the Sally Hudson bill that passed in 2020. That is blanket permission for any locality to adopt it with just that majority vote. if we want to expand it to school boards and other local offices, if we want to include towns, if we want to carry it over to apply to any election level above a local election, so legislative, congressional, Senate, president, etc., that will require a statutory bill through the General Assembly. We had a couple of them out there this session. They all died. Some of them died, sad 7 a.m. subcommittee deaths. And the one that we thought had the best shot of getting through would have allowed the parties to opt in. These are all optional at this point, right. To opt in to use ranked choice voting for their primaries, for their presidential primaries. And it turns out that Virginia's infrastructure that would be needed to run that whole process across local lines, across jurisdictional lines, isn't quite complete yet. So Virginia is not ready. They will be ready, but no one wanted to rush it and try to roll it out for a statewide election in 24. But localities are good to go. Any locality that wants to run RCV can.
Okay, so Jerome, we'll let you have the last word. On the crusade, which interesting name, which sounds, it's definitely
Well, thank you. The interesting thing about it is that when we decided to go with ranked choice voting, we didn't know where we were going with it. Well, someone said in one of our meetings, it said, when we do our endorsements for the delegate or for officers, not so much our members, the officers that's running the Richmond Crusade for Voters, but for our elected officials, they said, let's use ranked choice voting. And I said, I did not expect that coming from you. And so we're looking at it in the exec committee to say, how do we handle our endorsements for the most part? And will we use ranked choice voting? And I think we probably will use ranked choice voting when we start looking at our delegates. Just quickly, there's some other organizations that I belong to, and one of them is how we're going to spend some of the city's money. And so we said, what we're going to do is give folks a vote. But as far as choosing the program that will actually win out, we're going to use ranked choice voting for that. So I think what's happening is you'll start hearing organizations using more and more and more, which our elected officials are going to say, why are we not doing this?
Right. No, I think it's definitely an awakening. I think we, you're hearing more and more. I know people in this room have advocated and talked about it. So we appreciate the start of this discussion today. And Liz, good luck at Upvote Virginia, and Jerome, Legions. It's been really a pleasure to meet you. I hope we can work with you more as well. We know we have a big election season coming up, so it's going to be all about educating voters. So thank you so much. And thank you for everybody out there holding on. We went over today because we had really, I guess we were just a little bit of verbose today. A lot of, sometimes I overtalk. But I want to thank you again for being here, all our guests, and also to our patrons that supported us. If you're feeling a little generous today, I want to put a few bucks in our coffee cup. Become a patron. It's really a great community. You get a background that you see here in the room. And also just a thank you again to Ben Lynchfield, Dolly Langa, Deanna Bear, Blith Merritt, Alexandra Ritchie, Marianne Lako, and Sue Nelson Sargent, and Shamali Hoff for again supporting us. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, and hope you stay for the after chat. We're just going to go straight to credits, and I'll see you on the other side. And thank you to the wonderful team in the room. Give them a big wave. Thank you, everybody.